Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusek, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. The United States is celebrating its 250th birthday, marking 2.5 centuries since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That a country as expansive and diverse as ours has remained united under a single constitution for 2.5 centuries, passing through multiple existential wars, including a civil war, and numerous periods of traumatic political and economic upheaval, is a monumental achievement by any historical standard. How might we assess this moment from a Catholic perspective? What is it about the United States of America that is politically and morally distinctive? What binds us together as a people? Is it accurate to say that we are a Christian nation? If not, what conception of God is operative in the founders' references to the divine? And if so, what should we make of the future of America, given the dramatic decline of church attendance among both Catholics and Protestants in recent decades? Perhaps most importantly, for this moment, what can we learn from our collective past as Americans to guide us into the future? Here to address these questions and to share his experience participating in the recent Rededicate 250 event on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., is Bishop Robert Barron. Welcome back to the studio, Bishop.
Thanks, Matt.
So today we're celebrating the United States' 250th birthday. This episode is actually going to air just after the 4th of July. So we're really close to the birthday itself. We'll be assessing its past and its future of our country from a Catholic perspective. But before we do, what have you been up to lately?
Yeah, so this airs early July. So as we record it, I'm just back from Orlando. I was there with the other bishops of the country for they call it the spring meeting. It takes place in June typically. And about a 3-day meeting. Then I was down for a couple of fundraisers for Word on Fire. So a little Florida jaunt. But also while we were there in Orlando, we bishops consecrated the country to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which was it was a great moment, a lovely ceremony. Also, I was struck. I did a little ex-post on it that the president wrote of the United States, President Trump, a marvelous sort of affirmation of what we were doing and joining, his will to ours, and it was a rather extraordinary statement for an American president to make.
It really is. That's even historic.
I think so. I mean, I said it's kind of unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, that a president would be that, upfront about kind of affirming what Catholic bishops are doing.
And something very specific, too, to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, not just sort of...
Yeah, so anyway, that was an interesting moment, and the ceremony was lovely.
Well, to set the table for today's conversation, Bishop, we'll be getting into a talk that you gave recently in Washington, D.C., and a prayer as well. But tell us a little bit about that event, this Rededicate 250 event that you were invited to. How did that invitation come about, and what did you do there?
I think I first heard about it when I was there for one of the Religious Liberty Commission meetings. So the past year, I pretty much every month went to Washington for one of these meetings. And I met a number of the people involved in the government. And I think I heard a rumor about this many, many months ago. They were going to have this event and, wondering whether I would be willing to speak. And then finally, the invitation came formally. And, my perspective was, it's the country's birthday. It's on the National Mall. They're inviting a Catholic bishop to talk about the interface between, American polity and Catholicism. Why would I say no to that? Some people insist on reading everything through this relentlessly, partisan lens.
Right.
I just wasn't reading it that way. I was reading it as it's a celebration of our country. And so it gave me the opportunity to reflect a little bit on that, which I think is a very important theme.
So we'll be exploring some of the key themes in the address and in the prayer you gave. I think, Bishop, perhaps the fundamental question that many Catholics and certainly our Protestant brothers and sisters have in mind as we look to the past and we look to the future of the country is what is the answer to this question? Is the United States a Christian nation? How would you answer that? Or perhaps do you find a problem with the premise of the question and then it might be conflating the political with the religious?
Yeah, I'm a First Amendment man. So the First Amendment to our Constitution has this wonderful and lively tensions. On the one hand, Congress will make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So we don't have established religion in the United States. Are we a Christian nation? Well, of course not. If by that you mean, is Christianity somehow the established religion, or is Catholicism, or is Lutheranism? No, is the answer to all those questions. And our founding fathers, who knew about established religions. And indeed, to be fair, some of them were in the particular states, and their constitutions had established religions. But they knew about it in their home, in the homeland of England. They didn't want that in the new country. They didn't want the government officially sanctioning and then requiring people to participate in a particular religion. I always think of my hero, John Henry Newman. When Newman becomes a Catholic mid-19th century, that was not just a little matter of, he went from one private belief to another. That meant his whole life had to change because Anglicanism was the established religion of England, still is, but more radically in those days. It meant Newman had to resign from Oxford. It meant he couldn't hold any public position if you're not holding to the 39 articles of the Anglican religion. That's what an established religion looks like. The American founders didn't want that. So are we a Christian nation in that sense? No, absolutely not. Are we a Christian nation in the sense that certain values and ideals that come up from a biblical foundation, mediated largely through the Christian churches, because most of the founders were Christians, are they indispensable to the way we think about and structure our democracy? Well, yes, is the answer to that. In that sense, are we a Christian nation? Yes, only in that sort of broad sense that these biblical values inform our political arrangement. So that would be the way to answer that. So you're probably right in suggesting that it's kind of a provocative and somewhat improper way to pose the question. I would say our understanding of religion is conditioned by the First Amendment. So the first part of that is non-establishment. The second part is the free exercise clause. So there should be no restriction of the free exercise of religion, meaning not just privately, but in the public space. Are Christians, therefore, and all other religious people allowed to express their faith, to live their faith, to enact their faith in a public context? The answer to that is yes. And so the American approach is in between those two poles, if you want. Not establishment, but free exercise. That's where I would try to frame the question.
What conception of God do you think the founders had in mind when they were crafting the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution?
That's a complicated question. I would say it's an idea of God clearly coming up from the Bible, but conditioned to some degree by the Enlightenment rationalism of the time. Therefore, having a more deist, let's say, tone than classical Christian theology would have. Biblical, but conditioned by certain changes that took place, let's say from the High Middle Ages through the rise of voluntarism, the rise of nominalism, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. That represents a certain trajectory of ideas in regard to God. At the end of that, so now we're mid-18th century, there's a particular view of God that is not the same as Thomas Aquinas's. Okay, so do I think there was a kind of devolution? Yeah, I think a less adequate account of God. Nevertheless, it was an account of God, and God was being taken very seriously. Here's a way to look at it, Matt. I wouldn't turn to Thomas Jefferson or Tom Paine or Benjamin Franklin to get a really theologically precise understanding of God. Nevertheless, Thomas Jefferson speaks of God, presumes the laws of nature and of nature's God, knows that our rights come from God. And look, I'll take all of that. All of that I think is really good and right and has an ultimately biblical foundation. Though by the 18th century, it's been nuanced and mitigated in certain ways.
So another kind of historical and conceptual question mixed together. To the extent that Christian conceptions, specifically Christian conceptions of God, do animate and ground our founding documents, are they an expression of mere Christianity in C.S. Lewis's language, or, as some have argued, are they distinctively Protestant in some way?
Well, again, that's a subtle question. And to give it the more positive spin, I'd say, yeah, there's something of that Lewis mere Christianity, you might say, that it's an idea of God that a lot of people could broadly accept, even though we'd make, nuanced clarifications. I'll give an example. John Adams certainly believed in God, but he was a Unitarian.
Right.
by most accounts. Yeah. He didn't believe in the Trinity. Well, that's a pretty serious defect if you're an Orthodox Christian. I'd say broadly speaking, you could say that more of the mere Christianity approach. Is it a more Protestantized? The answer, I think, clearly is yes. Now, if you want to get technical, I'll go back to my little trajectory. from Thomas Aquinas' understanding of God as ipsum esse, as that in which essence and existence coincide. And therefore, that power in and through which all created things exist, all things participating in God, who's the active to be itself. If that's a more adequate account, that has changed a lot from the time you get to the 18th century. And again, it's because of voluntarism, nominalism, Protestantism, and the Enlightenment, you get a more deist conception of God. God is a distant supreme being, for example. And now, to be fair, it's not just a Protestant problem there. Go back to someone like Occam, in the late Middle Ages, that God is construed now as a being among many. Look at Scotus's univocal conception of being, also gave us God as a being among others. I would argue those two late medieval moves led by steady steps to nominalism and therefore to Protestantism. Luther and company are very influenced by nominalist philosophy. That influences their idea of God. Take another step. Luther's very, I would say, competitive understanding of God and the world. If I get any glory, then it's taken away from God. For God to get all the glory, I need to have nothing. I'm nothing. God's everything. I'm justified by grace alone, faith alone. See, all of that, I've argued before, I think is the fruit of a competitive view of God, which in turn is conditioned by this, I would say, inadequate metaphysics of God as one being among many. So to that degree, I think that view of God, more Protestant than Catholic, is probably animating the minds of most of our founders,
And just another follow-up question on that, but I just want to pause and highlight, as you just sort of dilated on, giving us a brief history of ideas, on just how important metaphysical claims about the nature of God and reality are for political matters down the line. They are intimately connected.
Talk to anyone who's ever studied philosophy and, philosophy, what a waste of time. But ideas have consequences.
Yes.
That's one of the basic insights if you study any history. And not just history of ideas, study history, tout court. You'll find its ideas trickle down and then have a massive effect on the ground. And so, yes, this shift that happened in the course of many centuries, let's say from, 1270 in Thomas Aquinas to 1776, those 500 years, there are a lot of changes in the understanding of God, and that does have an impact on the way we think about our humanity and about our politics.
Mm-hmm. So setting aside the historical question, which really I think ultimately can't be completely answered with complete confidence of what was in the founders' minds, in terms of the actual coherence of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, does it have a coherent foundation absent a biblical conception of God and the claims that it makes?
Well, I would say this, absent the idea of a creator God who is the ground of freedom and the ground of equality and the ground of rights. Apart from that, I think our democracy becomes incoherent. And that's, by the way, saying a mouthful. That's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah.
I've argued, equality. All men are created equal. Equality. There's no political philosopher prior to this period that would put equality. We're not equal. We're radically unequal human beings. Are you kidding? In intelligence, in beauty, in virtue, in strength, we're all radically unequal. And classical political philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, it's precisely our inequalities that must be taken into consideration when constructing the just state, right? So only certain people, for Aristotle, are capable of public life. Most people aren't. And the better you know that, the more just your society.
Right.
In Plato, the three levels of society, and you belong in one or the other. So where's this come from? This idea that we're created equal, and I've suggested it's that little word created that we tend to run right past. All men are created equal. Right. We're not equal in any other way, but we are equally creatures. We're all equally children of God. Take God out of the equation, and then people have tried. You can appeal equally in our intelligence or our freedom or something, but it's going to fall apart. Yeah. We're going to fall right back into these radically, divided societies. So I think that's deeply dependent upon an understanding of God, equality.
So you've already laid the foundation to the answer to this question, but just to ask it more directly, you directly quote the great Bishop Fulton Sheen, who's soon to be beatified, in the address you gave at the Rededicate 250, saying, the quote is, the Declaration of Independence is a declaration of dependence on God. Dilate on that a little bit.
I found that quote. I didn't know that quote until I was writing this paper. And I was kind of looking around, researching, and I found something on the web. I think I looked up actually Fulton Sheen and American democracy or something, just to get some, like, what would Sheen say about this? And I came across that quote and I thought, that's really good. That says it. Because it really is a declaration of independence from Great Britain, and we're affirming our rights and our freedom and so on. But we can do that only because we're affirming at the same time our radical dependence upon God, that our freedom, our equality, our rights come from God. Mm-hmm. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Take that out of the equation, what's going to happen? The rights will evanesce, because if they come from something less than God, they come from, public consensus, they come from the government, they come from a social elite, they can be taken away, right? And so it's wonderful what Sheen saw, that I can't really declare the great things I want to declare in the Declaration without affirming at the same time my radical dependence upon God.
You also say in the address you gave in D.C. that freedom is so central to who we are as Americans, we who live in the land of the free, because, and I'm quoting you here, freedom is essential to human dignity. Now, the connection you make here between dignity and freedom may come as surprising to some Americans who hear the word freedom, including in our civic context, and think, you know what that means? That means being able to do whatever you want with as little government intervention as possible. And indeed, the same sort of ideological understanding of freedom would say that that's what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means. You get to define happiness, but you really push against that idea. So say more about why.
It's a key element there. And first of all, John Paul II was very strong on this, that, human dignity, which is maybe the fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching, and indeed essential to that is freedom. I mean, no one wants to be bossed around. No one wants to have a boot on their neck. No one wants to be, coerced in their action and so on. Part of our dignity is that we have the freedom to, now here's the hinge, to pursue the good, right? When freedom is construed, as you suggest, simply as self-invention, as my own choice, and don't tell me what to do, well, that becomes slavery in very short order, right? The classical understanding that John Paul II would have accepted, and Thomas Aquinas, is freedom is an ordering of desire toward the good, right? So that I'm free from the sin and attachment that keep me from attaining the good. I'm freed from those distractions, attachments, and therefore I'm free for pursuing the good, right? Which is why, and this is very important, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, there's a very modern way to read that, and who knows exactly what's the mind of Jefferson, where you could say, well, okay, I'm not defining happiness. I'm just pursuing it, any way I want. But I think he would persuasively argue that Jefferson had enough of the classical understanding in him that happiness, and from Plato through Aristotle and Cicero and Thomas Aquinas, they're all deeply interested in defining what that is. What is happiness? That it has to do with the inculcation of virtue. It has to do with the pursuit of high goods, right? And so when Jefferson says he's relating liberty to the pursuit of the good, of virtue, is that the purpose of government? Is that the sort of trajectory of our rights? And I would say yes. Now, again, that's a debate among those who look at the founding. Can you read Jefferson in a very modern way? He's not really defining happiness. He's just saying pursue it any way you want. I don't know. I think it's fairer to say he's got that classical understanding of happiness is correlated to virtue.
To sort of follow that thread a bit further in terms of its implications. So again, setting aside what was in the founders' minds, it seems that your case is that if we define happiness as completely open-textured, as not having any objective content, that actually will undermine the very foundation of our
Well, that's what I call the culture of self-invention, which is taken over today. I call it wokeism too, if you want. People get mad at me for that, but call what you want. This idea that freedom is the right to radical self-definition. It means freedom of choice. I'm free from external constraint or even internal constraint so that I can choose whatever I want. That's not freedom in the biblical sense or the classical sense. Thomas Aquinas wouldn't have accepted that view of freedom. And I think at their best, our founding fathers understand that, which is why life and liberty are ordered to happiness, right? And the government is there to kind of facilitate this process. And that's in line, not so much there with Locke and Hobbes. I think that's more in line with Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, that's more classical.
Now, that's where the debate comes down. And look, to be fair, I've argued on different sides of this over the years, because I think there is a Hobbesian, Lockean strain in Jefferson for sure. If you follow that all the way, you come to certain conclusions. I don't know. I think the founding is complicated, and you've got the Enlightenment strain, but you've got the biblical strain, and they're conditioning each other to some degree in these very fertile minds. Mm-hmm. It's, I think, worth pointing out, worth celebrating as we come to our great anniversary. Look at that moment in time when you've got Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin and John Jay and John Adams. An extraordinary confluence of top flight minds who were also politically interested people. When does that happen?
Yeah.
When has that happened in our history? It was, I really do think, something providential about the way these figures came together at that time. Now, they're not Thomas Aquinas. If I were inventing a country, I'd go back to Thomas Aquinas. But they're pretty impressive, these figures. And, thank God for them.
Yeah.
I remember this years ago, I was in Boston. I was speaking to the priests of Boston, right, for their convocation. And I finished the thing, and I'm on the way to the airport, and this priest of Boston is driving me. And we're going by, and I see even Braintree or Quincy or, I said, oh, that's where John Adams and John Quincy Adams are from. He goes, oh, yeah. He goes, they're buried there. I said, no kidding. I'd love to see that. And it's a church, and we pulled up, and there they were, the graves of John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And I remember I was just very moved by that moment to look at those graves and boy, the courage, and intelligence and just the moxie of those people and the high intelligence of those figures that gave rise to our country. Thank God for them.
Yeah. Great appreciation for not only the past generically, but for past people who made great sacrifices. So Bishop, you've already noted the importance of equality and we could even say theological foundations, but there appears to be, and I want to emphasize, appears to be a conundrum with the relationship between equality and freedom, and it takes this form, especially in a political context. The more equal a society, the less free it will be. The freer society, the less equal it will be. How does the Constitution work that out?
Well, see, I would say, we're facing this problem today, which is this sort of equity problem. If a forced equity, a forced equality at different levels, that's not what the Founding Fathers were interested in. They were remarking our equality as children of God, our equality as possessors of rights, right? That has to be recognized and appreciated. It doesn't mean equity of outcome,
Right.
So the famous debate today, are you for equality of opportunity or equity of outcome? It's A, not B, I would say. Equality of opportunity is something which is deeply American. It's an expression of justice. Equity of outcome, that's where, the limitation of freedom. If you say, well, we got to be equal in all these different ways, and the government is the vehicle by which we achieve that equality, now we're into a very totalitarian understanding.
Right.
And one thing these people in the 18th century Philadelphia was totalitarian. They had a very keen sense of the danger of like the British monarch in their case, but they didn't want that. So that's an important distinction. We're equal in our rights, in our dignity, in our prerogatives, in our right to opportunity, all of that, yes. But a forced equality across the board, no, that's not what we want.
Yeah, another line from your address that really stuck out for me is when you state, and I'm quoting you again here, quote, patriotism and piety are not at odds with each other. Patriotism and piety are not at odds with each other. Now, again, try and think from, I know what you mean, but some may hear that and say, Bishop Barron, that is a paradigmatic example of the mixing of church and state. So what's your response to that critique?
Yeah, no, the response is the pious person, so saying in the biblical sense, is going to recognize that these principles of the Bible are indeed ingredient in the founding of our country and what makes our country great. And one we haven't mentioned yet, so we talk about freedom, about equality, human dignity, all that. I'd also mention limited government. It is so important. Look across human history. There's such a tendency in us sinners to create absolute government. Look at the ancient world, deifying political leaders all the time. There's Persia, it's ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Caesar, he's just a canny street politician, but he becomes a god, after he dies. And Caligula. Look at the biblical accounts where the people around them are deifying their leaders. The Bible hates that.
Yeah.
The Bible, and almost unique in the ancient literature of the world, hates that, sees through it, right? All political arrangements are under God, under the authority of God. The founding fathers, they knew that in their bones, and they did not want a polity that arrogated to itself that kind of supreme authority. So they knew limited government and acknowledging the fallenness of everyone involved in government, which is why now read, Madison and Hamilton, those people, the checks and balances. That's a brilliant move. And it's born, I would say, of the Bible above all. Yes, good, but I'm suspicious of you and you're suspicious of me, rightly, because I'm a sinner. I'm suspicious of you. And the press is suspicious of the whole operation. And the whole operation is suspicious of the press because we're all fallen. So the best we can do is balance each other, check each other, That's a biblical intuition. So to get back to your question, the pious person recognizes all these biblical principles as operative in the political arrangement of our polity. And so, I'm a patriotic American. I believe in those things because I'm a biblical person, right?
Beautiful, yeah.
That's how I'd put it.
So before turning to our listener question, Bishop, let's look to the future now, and in particular how we can move forward with confidence and with wisdom amidst our current challenges. So one of those challenges actually comes from within the Catholic intellectual tradition. As you know, there are some strands within contemporary Catholic political thought that are highly skeptical of the long-term viability of the American experiment because they believe it's based on very flawed, irredeemably flawed conceptions of God and humanity and virtue and things like that. So how do you respond to what's typically called the post-liberal critique of the American experiment?
Yeah, I respond to it with great respect, first of all. And I've had not quite this table, but the other program, I've had both D.C. Schindler and Patrick Deneen on.
Right, yeah.
And they're great representatives of that point of view. In fact, I asked both of them, okay, if you're at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, what would you have done differently? I asked both of them that question. And look, I understand their criticism, which is if you take the Enlightenment strain, which is there, and I'll trace it this way, from Thomas Hobbes, right, 16th century figure, who says, in the state of nature, it's just every man for himself. And that's the way it is, But that makes life nasty, poor, brutish, and short, right? Therefore, we kind of grudgingly accept government. We give our authority over to a sovereign, basically to keep us from each other's throats, right? So I got to protect my right, and you got to protect your right. So we have a government that we've invested in to protect us from each other. What that is, clearly, and Hobbes is upfront about it. He's rejected the classical view that the purpose of government is to make us good or to orient our freedom toward virtue. No. Government exists to protect us from each other, right? From Hobbes to Locke, you can make the case that Locke is a softened but still basic Hobbesian understanding of government. Rights-oriented, individualistic, bracketing ultimate goods. Thomas Jefferson, does he take in Locke, which means taking in a Hobbesian view? Do you see it in, the purpose of government is what? To protect our rights.
Yeah.
All right, and that strain is there for sure. If you follow it all the way, you get to the post-liberal criticism that what this is a very liberal understanding, a very modern understanding that has repudiated the classical view. Go back to someone like Leo Strauss, you'll find a similar argument, right? That the American thing can't really give rise to authentic justice. And it's destined for collapse. Well, see, my argument would be, yes, there is that strain in the founders. If that's all there were no further check on it, no other perspective, then there'd be legitimacy to that critique. Was there also a deeply biblical sensibility? Were there at least the remnants of a classical understanding in a lot of these people? I would say yes to both of those. And that mitigates to some degree the Hobbesian. The other observation I make is the Tocquevillian insight, right? That yes, you've got the government and all its arrangements, but alongside of government, you have religion that is flourishing in the public sphere and is informing the society morally and religiously. And that adds this element of the spiritual, the moral, and so on to what is essentially a secular understanding of government. There's complexity around the founding that makes it difficult. And the post-liberals see something very real in the founding. I might suggest that it's a little too restricted a vision of how the founders understood what they were doing.
And perhaps restrictive in recognizing the great accomplishments, including for Catholics within the United States as well, that this system has provided.
And that's very interesting if you look at now late 19th century Cardinal Gibbons and the famous speech in Rome when he becomes a cardinal in the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere, one of my favorites in Rome. And there he gives this famous address where he says just that, was like, hey, say what you want, Europeans, because they were down on the American arrangement at the time. Say what you want about this. It's really been good for us, and we have flourished under these conditions. Well, that's not Whistling-Dixie. I mean, that's no small claim to make, and it's an important one. You know.
Second Bishop, how do you respond to those? And this is a particularly virulent but also powerful strand right now in our culture, to those who say, look, the United States, the American experiment is fundamentally flawed because it's based on this morally corrupt foundation of slavery. And so everything that's come after it is, we should not take as a serious, viable political option anymore.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that it's based on slavery is silly. I mean, the sort of 1619 project stuff is silly. That slavery is a kind of original sin. I mean, I get that. I mean, that it's there kind of marring our polity from the beginning. That it's not solved, I mean, substantially till the Civil War. There's no question from the Constitutional Convention, 1787, all the way to 1861, it's the dominant concern of American politics. They hadn't solved that problem. And the best spirits of the time, culminating in someone like Lincoln, understood that we can't endure half slave, half free. This is not going to work. This is politically and morally untenable. So I get that. I mean, that this thing was there in our polity, and that problem had to be solved. So I acknowledge all of that. You know, I'm not going to acknowledge though that our country was founded upon slavery, or that our economy was grounded in slavery. I think the founders they were conflicted about it. Jefferson, even as he owned slaves, says these fiercely negative things about slavery. Washington, I think, a deeply conflicted figure about it. Franklin is an abolitionist, you know. The North tended in that direction, the South for economic reasons and otherwise. In the other direction, okay, it's a mixed bag, the founders. And they bequeathed to the country this unresolved problem. And it took, Frederick Douglass and it took Abraham Lincoln and those people to finally figure it out. So anyway, I would acknowledge all of that, this original sin that haunted our politics up until the Civil War, certainly. But I'm not going to say the country is rooted in it.
It's a false historical claim, I think, is important to highlight there.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And finally, Bishop, do you see a connection between effective evangelization and the securing or perhaps the restoring of the integrity and viability of the American experiment? And I ask that question also within the context of your observation of Tocqueville's recognition that the American Republic is the combination, it's the comprehensive unification of the government and this sort of civic culture that's highly religious. If that drops out, do we lose the bottom to everything?
Yes. I think it's, again, we're not advocating the establishment of any religion, but I think when religion is not exercised freely in the public square, our democracy is threatened. Yes, I agree with that. Because as we've been exploring, without these biblical principles, the great foundations of our country are undermined. Now, if you want maybe another show we could do on this, but look at some of the trends in our politics today when explicit Marxists and communists are presenting themselves. That's dangerous business. And that means people that really are not sympathetic to the foundations of our country. And what's one of the marks of Marxism and communism? Atheism, an attack on religion. So that's not a trivial problem at all. Maybe we do another show on that, but that's not a trivial problem. And yes, to that degree, I think a healthy religiosity is important for a healthy democracy.
It's now time for our listener question, Bishop. So today we have Brian from Columbus asking about the efficacy of praying for our politicians.
Hello, Bishop. This is Brian from Columbus. You have created a tremendous organization. Thank you for all that you do. Ever since I can remember, a constant petition has been said at Mass. Our politicians are always prayed for. Well, given today's state of most governments, is this an exercise in futility? Does God choose not to listen to this one? Or would it be much worse if we didn't pray for them? It just seems like a time waster. I would love to hear your insights. Thank you for your time.
I think I'm getting the gist of, is it a good idea to pray for politicians? Should we do it? Is it a waste of time?
Does it make any difference?
Would it make any difference? I'll make first an observation in the Catholic liturgy. So when it comes to the prayers of the faithful, to some degree, it's up to the celebrant or to a committee that puts these prayers together. But we are explicitly recommended to pray for the Pope, to pray for the sick and for the dead, and also for public officials. Yeah. So I always do that. Whenever I'm leading that prayer, it's just a spontaneous thing. I always pray, at least for those 4 petitions. And of course, St. Paul instructs us to pray for those in political power. Yeah, anyone charged with the common good, they need prayers. And prayer is always a good thing. In fact, pray for your enemies. Let's say the people in charge you don't like very much, pray for them, especially, I remember there are times over the years when I've said, we pray for our president, for our governor, and so on. And people said to me, how can you be praying for that, fill in the blank, if you're a Republican or a Democrat? Look, I don't care who it is. I'm going to pray for anybody who's in political power. They can use our prayers. So, no, I think we should definitely do that.
Well, thank you, Brian, for reaching out to us. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron in a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. We're always grateful to hear from you. Well, there's so much more to say, Bishop.
Yeah,
but, thank you for the conversation.
Topic, yeah.
Look forward to the next one.
God bless you, man. Thanks.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.